All right, excellent. Okay, so uh, in recent history, and I say that as in the last couple hundred years, I think there's just a massive shift, predominantly towards humanism philosophically, and over time that's moved to really staunch and antagonistic atheism, not just agnosticism where there's uncertainty, but atheism. And atheism generally tends to deny the idea of faith, right? If you ask an atheist, do you have faith? They will get pretty upset at you, usually to the point of sometimes raised voices and whatnot. I've really cheesed off a number of atheists and agnostics over the years pushing on these buttons. But the reality of the matter is that they have faith, and that faith is in the idea that science knows enough and has enough answers to make declarative and absolute statements. So when I asked the loaded question last week to close off our discussion for the homework, what I really wanted to focus in on is the fact that if you say you know everything about everything, then you can maybe make a declarative statement. Now you might be wrong, right? But theoretically, if you were right, you can make a declarative statement. God, as creator and owner of the universe, can make a declarative statement about the universe and be accurate and be right because he made it, he designed it, he sustains it. But when you talk about science to an atheist and an agnostic and then tie that to their sense of faith or belief, they get really upset. We talked previously about the Van Tillian argument from presuppositionalism, that this idea that if you ask why long enough, you will find someone's presuppositions. One such presupposition is that Christians hate science. I'm not going to skip that part yet. Here's a quote I've got in the handout here. Richard Dawkins saying, "I am against religion because it teaches us to be satisfied with not understanding the world," which is an absurdity. It is a misrepresentation of religion and a misrepresentation of human beings, which as a Christian, my desire to understand how the world works is fundamentally related to the idea that God created it and sustained it, and I can learn more about him as a designer if I learn about the world and understand it. So not only does he make assumptions about his position, he makes assumptions about our position and religion as a whole that I think are fundamentally flawed and pejorative. After that, we've got one. Here's Ernest Hemingway's: "Faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate." Oh, I'm sorry. That's not Hemingway. That's another Dawkins quote. Evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, even perhaps because of the lack of evidence. And I think that's a misdefinition of faith. We want our faith to be in the facts. And just because we can't take God's temperature and we can't, touch God in a physical sense right now, doesn't make faith fundamentally believing in the sky fairies. So, and we'll talk about that a bit more. The next quote is a Hemingway quote: "All thinking men are atheists," and I would argue that that's definitely a false assertion. And I would argue that if you are really thinking hard and long, atheism is very presumptive, and so you would have to, at the very least, step back from atheism as an absolutist position that can't be defended. And then this quote from Asimov is one I've run into a few times. "Properly read, the Bible is the most potent force for atheism ever conceived." Now, what is fascinating about the first two words of that Asimov quote?
He says properly read,
Yeah, what is that assuming?
assuming he knows the Bible properly.
Yeah, yeah, and if you don't conclude atheism, then you haven't properly read the Bible. I would argue that properly read, the Bible is the most potent force for theism ever conceived. And I think we have some strong arguments that we've made so far about the, not only in your homework, but in some of the other discussion we've had around the veracity of the scriptures, around how we can defend its existence on the planet. And I think we can also defend the, not only the existence of God, but the creation of the universe. So let's talk about the faith of scientism, okay? Here are 10 presuppositions of science. Okay, and we won't go through all of them, but all scientists hold to at least 10 scientifically unverifiable positions. That is, things that are assumed before collecting any data, okay? So presuppositions that they have. Now, let me ask real briefly, are presuppositions by themselves inherently evil or bad?
No.
No. But the arrogance of science is often presented as though there are no presuppositions, they only have facts. And that is that leap of faith that we want to call them out on. These are things that cannot be proven scientifically, yet they are necessary to carry on science. Okay, so all scientists, whether they're aware of it or not, or whether they will even admit to it or not, have faith in at least these 10 presuppositions. And here's the list. Here's the existence of an external world. Now, we don't freak out when we hear that there's the existence of the external world, but philosophically speaking, there is no way to verify that. All I can talk about is my experience of things. The orderly nature of the external world. That's really important. You know, when we do tests in a scientific lab, doing, you know, using the scientific method and the scientific principles, those rely entirely on the orderly nature of the external world. We have a real problem if different things happen over and over and over again. My oldest daughter is almost an adult. She'll be 18 in August. But once she was born, we realized that a lot of the things that we were wanting to watch on television were not necessarily gross or foul, because we try to keep that out of our lives, but there were sometimes things where we would have surprise vocabulary. So we ended up watching a lot of the Food Network. And one of the things that fascinated me about the Food Network is there were shows where they would basically have to talk about the science of process so that you could get consistent results. But at no point in time did anybody talk about, watch out, because when you're cooking this egg, it's possible that it'll turn into an ostrich egg in the middle. It looks like a chicken egg, but once you crack it open and you pour it out into the cup, it's going to change. Or suddenly it's not an egg at all. Suddenly it's a toxic viper or some other thing. Like, that doesn't happen. We have order and we have consistent patterns and routines in the external world. And that is an assumption of science that will continue and maintain. Actually, if you talk to some progressive physicists and philosophers around that, some of them will argue that there are multiple versions of the universe, where whatever that order of nature varies.
Multiverse.
Yeah, the multiverse and whatnot. And then the knowability of the external world, the existence of truth in the universe, the laws of logic. Okay, and that number 5 there, the laws of logic, the best way to posit that, if you're going to talk to somebody about this idea, is a priori, or as an assumption, you are saying that we must use logic to reason our way to what we perceive as truth and understanding. But can you, without using logic, explain to me why I should use logic to reason to truth? And you'll find that difficult. No one should be able to answer that, as far as I can tell. You can't use logic without the presumption of logic, right? Number 6, the reliability of our memory, thinking, and sensory faculties to serve as truth gatherers and as a source of justified true beliefs. There's actually a whole field of science and research into cognitive bias and flaws in our intake facilities, so that you have things like blind spots and in your memory's ability to be influenced by various environmental contexts and things like that. So that is just kind of an interesting side tip note there. The adequacy of language to describe the world. I think that's fantastic. We assume language as a way to communicate. The existence of values in science, moral values, the idea that you would test theories fairly and report results honestly. That's an assumption. The uniformity of nature and the continuity of laws inherent in nature into the future. Okay, how do we go back to the Big Bang and look at the idea of particulate matter going from nothing to something? Well, we say that seems like that's a pretty bizarre change in our understanding of physics and the laws of thermodynamics and so forth. The same thing is true. Why do we not anticipate such radical shifts moving forward into the future? In which case, we'd have to retest all of our scientific hypotheses and whatnot. And lastly, the existence of numbers corresponding to nature in order to measure and model using mathematics. Okay, mathematics is generally an assumed system and mechanism, but our understanding of it continues to actually evolve, which is a fascinating rabbit trail. The Nobel Prize winning mathematician Gödel has actually, he did some early work on, well, early is maybe the wrong way. It's in the last 100 years. He did some work on the reliability of certain mathematical equations to produce things that were logically false despite being mathematically consistent. So that's beyond my field of expertise. I'm not a mathematician. I bought a book that took a summary of what he wrote and was pretty quickly able to tell that as an untrained mathematician, I wasn't prepared to dig into that. So I'm going to call myself out on having read about it, but not understood it. So just full disclosure, I don't want to deceive anybody unintentionally. All right, so these 10 assumptions or presuppositions are taken on faith. They can be confirmed in practice, but they must be assumed and taken on faith in order to put them into practice. Okay, and without them, there is no modern science. Okay, so the faith of science is a pretty big deal. And there's even more faith beyond those 10 presuppositions. But there's an important chart here on this next page. It says graduations in quality of subject matter of science. I'm going to jump back here. My PowerPoint slides, I should probably just ignore. But anyways, graduations in quality. So what do you notice about the gray or purple area that's there that is the most optimal part of what makes really good science? What do you notice about those?
All we can see there, all I can see is 10 presuppositions of science.
No, this is in the handout I sent out. Sorry, I don't know if you're looking at that or not. If you're not, sorry, that's no. Okay. Let me see if I can drag this up into my screen. Can you see that if I'm looking at my Word doc here?
It's still. Oh, that's coming. It's up there now, sir.
Yeah. There we go. Okay, let me see what I can do to minimize my. There we go. I like to have as little, shall we say, application chrome as possible for these sorts of things. Okay, so graduations in quality of subject matter for scientific studying purposes. So looking at this gray or this purple shaded area, what do you notice about the premium qualities for good scientific research? Do these ideas look like they're really good for handling 10 billion years ago or 5 billion years ago or even 1 billion years ago?
No, because past historical processes and events, we don't know what happened. We weren't there 1 billion years ago. We don't have evidence of that. We don't have historical records of that long ago, if
Yeah.
that long ago existed.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and again, you start to have to extrapolate, and then when you're extrapolating, you might be assuming. So it's not present. Okay, the present nature of science is really important for laboratory results. Right now, as the world is facing this COVID-19 situation, there are labs trying to put together vaccines, and I don't care how you feel about vaccines. Some people are for, or some people are against vaccines. But can you imagine if the technician working in the lab trying to develop the vaccine put substances in a petri dish, and then they went and they took a walk holding the petri dish and they set it down in the park, and then they went back to the lab and went, oh no, I forgot my petri dish back at the park, and then went back to the park and it wasn't there, and then somebody came to him and said, hey, what do you know about that petri dish? And he goes, well, the last time I saw it, do you want that vaccine injected in you? Does that seem like a good idea? It seems high risk. It's you the further you get separation away, and that could be talking about minutes or hours. If you take something out of it's no longer in a controlled environment, right? Like all these things start to kind of compound. So the present nature and small in scope and total access. Total access is the idea of enclosure, right? That you have isolation. That's important to have controlled inputs and measured outputs. If you say large in scope or scale or partial access, that's a problem. How many of you have ever gone to a pharmacy and looked at the warnings they put on a prescription when you take a medication? Has anybody had to do that?
Yeah, well, I would look at them. I would often look at them. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so the one of the reasons why I worked at a pharmacy in high school, so I sold drugs in high school, but it was legal. Um, but the thing is that when they have to do a blind test, a double blind test to be able to hopefully determine that the pharmaceutical is effective. In doing so, they remove themselves from key parts of the data to remove bias, and that actually creates unknowns. And so they have to report that the very prescription you're taking might cause the thing you're taking it for, because they don't know if the placebo or the prescription actually was part of the results in every case. So yeah, partial access causes all kinds of concerns. Okay. And then the idea of when we move out larger and larger into this grid here, we see past historical processes and events. So presently observe past human written and observation and other evidence from the past. That might be archaeology, paleontology, right? We're going to go and look at the past, observing what we know based on the data and the information and the science and the digging and the excavation. Is that as good as having live access to the Apostle Paul or our Lord Jesus Christ?
No.
Or for that matter, Darwin? We don't have them to talk to now. If we talk about any number of points in world history, we are now relying on smaller and smaller, more isolated data sets. And so when we say that scientifically, it is less optimal. Okay. And equally, if we move back, presently observe past human written observation and other evidence from the past, that's adding further layers. Okay. We're grateful to have Josephus's material, for example, but that is a further layer of extrapolation away from what is true and what is real as first point evidence, you start to have layers away from that. And then the last column on this list, past non-historical processes and events presently observe evidence from the past. Okay, we can do that, but we can also, in a larger scope, in a larger context, presently observe evidence from the past. So if the scope changes, the amount of data that we might be able to process and handle and connect to what we think we understand declines, right? So when my daughters were young, we actually went to a lecture for an astrophysicist from the University of Boulder, Colorado, who was talking about how it would be very wonderful if the federal government would spend $300 billion to build an antenna array, a satellite array on the other side of the moon, and put together an entire colony there to be able to transfer the information from the satellites back down to the Earth, so that hopefully we could get aftershock waves of the Big Bang. And what that says to me is that let's spend $300 billion, which is, for most people, that's more than they're going to earn in their lifetime, right? You have a tiny number of people like Jeff Bezos who might possibly earn $300 billion in his lifetime, or Bill Gates, right? But the average person is not going to earn $300 billion in their lifetime, let alone $1 billion in their lifetime. And they want $300 billion to go build this array of dishes to hopefully get glimpses, to get some kind of capture of an assumed Big Bang. Does that sound like sound science and probably a good justification of $300 billion?
Sounds ridiculous.
Money wise, it's nuts.
Yeah, I was going to say, can we solve homelessness and poverty and starvation maybe first?
Yeah.
Just saying. Once we get that squared away, let's see if we can get a Polaroid of the beginning of the universe. So anyways, any scientist who deals with past historical processes and events is dealing with abstraction. They're dealing with assumptions on certain levels, or at least risks of assumptions, I should say, at certain levels. And so when we say faith in science, but we then don't become aware of the assumptions, we're not really having faith in science anymore. We're having faith in scientists and their theories. And theories are not evil. Hypotheses are not evil, but we need to recognize them for what they are. Now, this next section here is going to talk about radioactive decay. And my dad actually, for a while, was going to be a geologist. He participated in some lab research on radioactive decay. So when he was talking to me about this when I was growing up, and when he speaks about this even today, it's not something that he's just read about in a book. He's participated in it. But the things that you see there is that there are certain things about radioactive decay that are presumptive about whether or not that radioactive material went back to a point of zero. Okay, so when you do radioactive decay analysis, how much did it start with? How much did the fossil, the rock, whatever it is, how much did it start with?
Can't tell.
You can't tell. And that's really important, because if you say, I don't know, then you say, I'm making an educated guess. Okay, that matters. It's okay to say it's an educated guess, but if you say this is faith in the facts, but you don't admit that your so-called facts are based on the best guess, or an assumption around the age of the universe, or an assumption around what took place to put the fossils there rather than a cataclysmic event, or all of those things start to come together. But if you never say it out loud, then it sounds pretty believable, right? Recently, in the last month, I read an article that a group of astrophysicists had discovered that the universe was not expanding at a uniform rate. So if you take that in from the Big Bang Theory concept, it was assumed that the universe was expanding at a given rate and that it was consistent. But all of the evidence actually points to the contrary. But nobody ever says, hey, we're assuming that. They just say this is science, right? And so we don't want to be detrimental to science. That Dawkins says, hey, Christians or people who are religious don't like science. No, I want science. I just don't want the arrogance of assuming that scientism is presenting so that you believe it or leave it. You either believe in the sky fairies or you believe in the truth. That's the way they present things. And I think that is not only a misrepresentation of actual science, but it's a misrepresentation of Christianity and other religions. So what it comes down to is the paleontologists have to put faith in their assumptions that were made. And the assumptions will remain a matter of faith, not science. Okay? So big deal there. Richard Dawkins wrote about the evolution of giraffes in at least 6 of his books. And he wrote that giraffes evolved from an okapi-like animal. Does everybody know what an okapi looks like?
No.
They look like a horse with giraffe stripes on their neck. Let me see if I don't know if I can't remember if I put a picture
I think
of
I
an
might have
okapi.
seen them before.
I have a photograph of an okapi from the Denver zoo that I actually took myself, but I don't have it here in my slide deck. But the thing is that Dawkins' assertion there says that this is where it came from, but they don't have any fossils that very directly link every stage of that so-called evolution. So instead, they assert that this is the highest probability if the theory of macroevolution is true.
Again, it all comes down to the theory of evolution is only a theory.
Yeah, and the thing is that and we'll get to this in a little bit, but microevolution, the idea that animals changed under an exposure to radiation after the firmament went away, for example, from a Genesis chapter 9 and on perspective, we can see that, yeah, there's lots of moths, but we don't have any evidence that all these things changed, and that there's steps that prove that. So the idea of this evolutionary process is interesting because in part what it shows is that if you need to explain the existence of the universe as you see it today, and you need to take God out of it, you must put some other mechanism in place. But if you cannot absolutely show those stages and steps, then you're not doing science, you're hypothesizing. You're you're doing theoretical explanations that are very difficult to prove out. So Dawkins, who hates the term faith, oh, somebody was about to say something. Go ahead.
Sorry, no, sorry.
That's okay. Dawkins, who hates the term faith, actually operates with a lot of faith. And in part it's because there is much that cannot be proven around transitional fossils. Now, I've read a multiple number of people have kind of cited the idea, so this has become almost lore, that 99% of all animals that have ever lived on the earth have already died. Okay? They've already become extinct because given this age of billions of years, there must be many dead animals, right? Nothing about that sounds shocking from a evolutionary perspective, except for that with all of that, we don't have the fossil record that shows that many dead animals to be billions of years old, or even millions. We find a scarcity of fossils in contrast. If the universe is as old as they're saying, and the earth is that old. So we want to talk next about epistemology in science, and that is, how can we know something? And one of the things that we talked about is it immediately observable? Is it in a controlled environment? Can we reproduce it? Those are all key things. So you can gather data. We can assume, what we assume before we begin gathering data and drawing conclusions through logic. Using logic and thinking and mathematics leads us to rational knowledge. Okay, rational knowledge is the things that we stepped through inductive reasoning. We stepped through things, and we gained what we like to call empirical knowledge, but that is a subset of the universe. Okay, the amount of time that we have records for is minimal. The oldest written languages go back not very many thousands of years in any meaningful way. So how do we know what happened before that? And if radioactive decay is any evidence of things, even the data we have is experiencing entropy at this very moment. So we're losing the chance to have understanding right now at this very moment. So making observations using our senses is called empirical knowledge. Science is a combination of these two things, rational and empirical knowledge, all of which was historically derived from a Christian worldview. Isaac Newton was accused of wasting his time on theology, for example, right? They said, oh, he pursued the hypothetical sky fairy of theology. What a waste. I've heard that stated multiple times. So repeated testing of the hypothesis, theory, or law serves as a check on the knowledge from the scientific process. And that's where we have reproducibility as an important element of science. But are there other ways of knowing something? And that's the Christian would answer yes. The Bible talks to us about God having revealed himself. That's outside knowledge that science can't provide. And that's where they choose to ignore that or reject that from the get-go rather than acceptance and investigation. So God revealed to mankind. Okay, here's a chart here. God is revealed through nature, providence, and conscience. Those are things touched on, at least in part, by Romans and Acts. And then God revealed himself specially through Scripture and Jesus Christ. And so this idea of revelation is specific and knowable and understandable and investigable. Right? We don't want to have faith in the I hope so's. We want to have faith in the facts. We want to have faith in what we can understand. We've already talked about the principles around hermeneutics a little bit in past classes that Brad's taught, but I'm assuming that's familiar enough to you. So we can look at veracity, we can look at hermeneutics. And then lastly, these are the four truth questions. You may be familiar with these. There are various folks who've shared these as part of evangelistic techniques. But these are four questions that we need to be able to answer yes or no to, and I would argue yes to from a Christian worldview. Is there absolute truth? And what did we say from the very beginning of this series about the opposite idea, or the saying no to that? Is it possible? If there is no absolute truth, that's self-refuting, right? Is that truth singular? Or is it you can have your truth and I have my truth? Okay, well, it's irrational, right? If there are multiple truths, then there is not truth, and it is not absolute. And if it's not absolute, then it's not true, right? So truth is singular. And then has the truth been given? And that's where we talk about, can God reveal truth through his word? And the answer is arguably yes. And then fourth, is the absolute singular given truth knowable? And so as Christians, we're very concerned with truth, and we're very concerned with being able to understand the universe and understand the world around us, but it's in light of a God who is knowable and understandable, and where truth is derived. Truth gets its definition in God. All right, so I want to hit on various scientific topics of discussion in light of the Bible, and this is where I am going to present something that on the surface might look a little liberal, but I'm hoping that after some thorough investigating here, you'll find that that's not my position at all. But I want to kind of help reason you through this, okay? So please don't be alarmed, and don't be offended. So you're probably familiar with the young Earth versus gap theory versus day-age theory for creation from the Bible. Is everybody familiar with those three terms? If not, we can take a few moments to talk about them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The gap theory. What's the gap theory?
Okay, so the gap theory suggests that there was a major gap between the first day and the second day, which allows for a Big Bang-like expansion.
Oh, it's like God. To God, one day is 1,000 years, kind of thing.
Oh no, so that's the day-age theory. But the gap theory is more like God said, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and the time between day one and day two was a massive gap. It's just not recorded in the scripture.
Oh yeah, gotcha.
That's this idea. It's an attempt to allow for the Big Bang without violating the veracity of the Bible. It's a little difficult because hermeneutically there's nothing there, right? If I say hermeneutically one day and we talk about one day, nothing in the text makes you think that one day is a varying amount of time in that context. But that is what it is. Now I want to, this is the part that's going to sound real liberal, but please understand that that's not my, I spelled origins wrong. Anyways, Norm Geisler here writes, after seriously pondering these questions for over a half century, my conclusions are, the young earth view is not one of the fundamentals of the faith. It is not a test for orthodoxy. It is not a condition of salvation. It is not a test of Christian fellowship. It is not an issue over which the body should divide. It is not a hill on which we should die. The fact of creation is more important than the time of creation. There are more important doctrines on which we should focus, like the inerrancy of the Bible, the deity of Christ, the Trinity, and the death and resurrection of Christ, and his literal second coming. As Rupertus Meldenius put it, in essentials unity, and non-essentials liberty, and in all things charity. And by all accounts, the age of the earth is not one of the essentials of the Christian faith. I put that quote in there because this is one of those things where there are people who will die on this hill and say, if you don't believe in the literal 6 days, you're going to hell. I might argue that that's a bit extreme, but what we need to actually look at here is it possible for us to have death before the fall, according to the theological constructs put forth by the Bible?
No.
At the very least, the concept of death seems to be a real shocker for Adam that he doesn't fully understand. So the idea that this Big Bang happened between day one and day two or something comes with a real cost theologically. And the day-age theory says each day is every 24 hours is some millions or billions of years. The days are out of order, and the theories that fits in there are, again, bringing death into the equation in a way that is very difficult. Okay? So yes, the universe is by design, and we would argue that all three of those positions hold that. We need to look at these fundamental issues to the creation account. Number one, God is creator and designer. Number two, man is created in God's image. Does evolution from goo to the zoo to you support man being created in God's image?
No,
Oh,
because they're still monkeys.
Yeah, it doesn't work. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Sorry.
you know, because evolution. If evolution made monkeys, and they say we evolved from monkeys, how come there's still monkeys?
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
that's a big problem. The idea that all transitional fossils need to be extinct is a problem. The idea that some things don't go extinct, what allows that to preserve, all of that is then again theorized, right?
Mm-hmm.
And lastly, the fall through Adam. We need a literal Adam who could fall to represent all of mankind. If we say that we have a Homo sapien genus or something, and this is just part of a larger group, and there's cavemen and all this broad diversity, we don't have a representative of mankind that is tenable to be the person that Romans 5 is so dependent upon, right? Romans 5 says through one man all fell, right? All sinned.
Yeah.
And through one man all can be redeemed through the work of Christ. If Adam is a hypothetical, just like some point in time throughout reproductive history, that doesn't work. We don't have a representative man. So if you take a different position that is not a literal 6-day creation, it definitely becomes theologically problematic. Now, I want to state something that I think is important. I'm going to call it a fourth position, but I don't think that's really a great representation. And that is that I believe we can argue for the in situ, that's the Latin in situ creation of the universe. Okay? God spoke it into existence and it was. Does it say God spoke and there were little baby cubs and little baby fish and little baby sprouts of trees? It doesn't say that at all. It says he made them as they were in their form. And by the time Adam is asked to name the animals, which I would argue is theologically, we need to spend more time as Christians talking about what that means, but that's outside of the context of this discussion. We'll have to have another class about that. But the Adam taking through the animals, they're there. He understands them as partners, as pairs, as mates. If they were cubs, that would be a little different. It would be presumptuous of his thinking, right? So there's attributes of what's there theologically that we can't ignore. Paul presents. Go ahead.
no, couldn't say anything.
Okay. All right. We have issues around God as creator. Acts 17 becomes real important. You know, Paul says God is creator as a fundamental part of the Christian worldview. If we don't make God creator and everything is just evolved kind of accidentally, only there was a big deity that just kind of spun it off, then Genesis through Acts 17 becomes highly problematic. Secondarily, if man was not created in God's image, then Christ taking the image of man within the hypostatic union would be novel at best. Okay, but Christ was taking on the image that was made after him. How about that? Man's made in his image, and Christ took that on. And lastly, the fall of mankind through disobedience in the garden is critical to the nature of salvation. Okay, the gospel is not described as man's gradual or moderate in ability or inadequacy. It's an absolute inadequacy starting with Adam. All right, so that's like, I think it's there are strong arguments for a literal 6-day creation with a universe made in situ. Okay, so does the Big Bang look like it happened? I don't think so.
No,
But does the universe appear to be expanding? Yes. Did God make it at no atoms to some atoms and then make them explode at a constant rate over billions of years? The scriptures
Big Bang,
don't.
there has to be a Big Banger.
Say that again, sorry.
For a big bang, there has to be a big banger.
That's right, yeah. And so the one of the important things about this is that if it's in situ, if it's in place, in delivered in a mature state, it reflects a God who knew what needed to happen for life in the universe to exist, to show and radiate as glory. And that's
winding
okay.
down as well.
Yeah, we don't. And the thing is,
yeah,
the winding down is important. So we're going to get into that as an argument against the Big Bang as it stands. So let's talk about the three classical arguments for God from the Christian worldview. So the secular philosophers have arguments against these, but they're all based on the presupposition that God doesn't exist at the starting point. Our presupposition is that God exists, and these are reasonable within that context, okay? So the teleological argument for God as creator, the teleological argument can be summarized succinctly as design implies a designer, okay? I almost never use the term teleological because I find most people don't get a lot of bang for that buck, no pun intended. But since the universe contains so many things that appear to have design, there must be a designer, okay? Paul's argument in Romans is that God is designer, and the universe declares his majesty because of that. The earliest recorded instance of the teleological argument for God is attributed to Socrates, which I think is kind of fun, since he was definitely not a Christian. And the intelligent design movement that started around 1987 is based roughly on the teleological argument. The intelligent design community tends to then distance themselves often from a literal six-day creation and a clean biblical understanding of the universe. They tend to just say, okay, there must be a creator, and so we need to believe in God, which is a little abstract. Maybe we don't want to reason from the point of abstraction to another point of abstraction. That ends up being less useful. Now, the fine-tuned universe or anthropic principle is something that I actually have a lot of respect for, but scientists and philosophies around scientism tend to reject it. So let's talk about this for a second. The fine-tuned universe argument states that everything that we observe that makes life possible implies that someone must have controlled things to get them into that state. Is everybody following along with what that means? Life couldn't exist outside of this context, right? So the fine-tuned universe argument is important. Now, the skeptical response, so you're probably familiar with the artist, the author, Douglas Adams, wrote the Hitchhiker's Guide. And his argument against this is that this would be like a puddle of water saying, well, this hole in the ground fits me just so perfectly, it must have been made for me. Now, so that on the surface sounds like he's just debunked the fine-tuned universe argument, except it is an oversimplification of the problem, and it's an oversimplification of the complexity of what makes the universe what it is. Just because we can observe it as it is and say that, well, it must be what it is, and we must live this way because that's the only way that it could be, or because we observe it, it is what it is, but it's not the only way that it could be. Those kinds of arguments don't really fill the full problem. They don't really address a full problem with the argument. Okay, so some examples of the fine-tuned universe is oxygen levels. On Earth, oxygen comprises 21% of the atmosphere. If oxygen were 25%, fires would erupt spontaneously. If it were 15%, humans would suffocate, at least in their current state. So evolutionarily, they have to explain those variations if it is something that they assert happened historically, right? Atmospheric transparency. If the atmosphere were less transparent, not enough solar radiation would reach the surface. If it were more transparent, would be bombarded with too much radiation and then die. It would have lots of impact on a number of other things. The moon Earth gravitational interaction has to be just right. If it's off, it doesn't work. Carbon dioxide levels, if the CO2 levels were wrong, we'd have runaway greenhouse gas effect, and it would just burn up the Earth. Okay, so we actually need a balanced amount of carbon dioxide. And gravity, I love this. If the gravitational force were altered by, and that's a lot of percentages there. I don't know what nth percent that is, but our sun would not exist, and therefore neither would we. Gravitational force is fundamentally critical. Centrifugal force, that's important. You know, the planet's moving at the right balance gives us the right seasons, which allows us to have full cycles of environmental change that cause seasons, right? The universe is moving at a rate of expansion that is just right. If it was moving at a different rate, it could collapse upon itself. And if it was expanding any faster, then no galaxies would have been formed. The speed of light. We have some argument around the actual speed of light, but if it was moving at a different rate, there are all kinds of constants would be adjusted. If Jupiter were not in its current orbit, the Earth would be bombarded with space material. It turns out Jupiter is running defense. The axis tilt, atmospheric discharge. There's a number of things in there, so I'll let you read the rest of those in the handout. But the thing is that all of those things have to happen at a consistent rate, or else if they're wrong, the Earth would not exist in its current state to support life. It all comes together in an awfully complex system to be just happenstance. So I tend to think this is a reasonable argument. There are those who might argue otherwise. I think it's awfully optimistic to discount that entirely. Cosmological arguments for God as creator. And this kind of gets into when we were talking about reasoning from nothing to God, or reasoning from nothing to the Bible earlier in the first lesson. This is a related argument. So, and I want you to look at the specific wording of number one here. Everything that had a beginning had a cause. Did God have a beginning?
No.
No. And that's an important way to word that, because when we say everything had a beginning or everything had a cause, then they say, well, what caused God? So if we word it, everything that had a beginning had a cause, then we can say, listen, we're stipulating that God had no 0th birthday. The universe had a beginning, and therefore the universe had a cause. Okay. God did not have a beginning.
Is God outside time?
Yeah, God's outside of time. And in fact, there's some really interesting things when we start to consider. Here's Frank Turek writes, whatever caused the Big Bang was spaceless, assuming that the Big Bang existed. Oh, wait, I'm jumping ahead. Let me not do that. Statistically speaking, it has been stated that it would be as likely for the Earth to fall into its place in the solar system inside of its galaxy, and life to form in the Earth or on the Earth, as for a tornado to blow through an airplane junkyard and assemble a fully working 737. After recent news around the 737 MAX, we'll assume that fully working is relative. But the statistical significance there leads to some kind of interesting observations around the anthropomorphic. Sorry, I'm going to say that wrong unless I read it. You'll forgive me. The anthropic Not anthropomorphic. That's different. Anthropic principle. So Frank Turek writes, whatever caused the Big Bang was spaceless because it caused space. It was timeless because it caused time. It was immaterial because it caused material, and powerful because it created out of nothing. Intelligent because what came into existence was precise, and personal because it made a choice to convert a state of nothing into something.
Yeah, I have a cross-examined on my phone. It's an app, but it's Frank Turek, and there's a lot of good stuff on it, you know.
Yeah, there's a lot of good information out there around thinking, but I think this is important because from a Big Bang perspective, these are real problems. It's spaceless because it caused space. The existence of space is not a requirement for the idea before God, or before God creating things. God didn't have to have space, but God could create space. The fact that we have space is significant. Okay, the time-space continuum requires space. Timelessness matters because time is our perception of chronology, right? And so when we look at that, something could exist before that, and I would say someone, not just something. But material is important too. The Big Bang, if we go back in time, the Big Bang goes back to an immaterial state, and there is no explanation for that. The assertion is that it must exist, but the reality is that it defies reasoning. This quote here from Dr. Jastrow, I think, is really interesting here. He was the director of the Mount Wilson Observatory. He stated, astronomers now find they have painted themselves into a corner because they have proven by their own methods that the world began abruptly in an act of creation to which you can trace the seeds of every star, every planet, every living thing in this cosmos and on the earth. And they have found that all this happened as a product of forces they cannot hope to discover. That there are what I or anyone could have supernatural forces at work is now, I think, a scientifically proven fact. And what I hate to tell you, but what is true, is that Dr. Jastrow never actually confessed to being a Christian at any point in time. But even as what I would argue as an agnostic, it was undeniable. So, very fascinating. The universe having a specific beginning time means that time does not go back infinitely. And the universe is expanding, right? The universe cannot unexpand infinitely, right? So time and space kind of coalesce or coincide there to this point of there is a point of zero that is inexplicable. The second law of thermodynamics says that the universe is running out of energy, also known as entropy, and it's in a state of entropy, and matter cannot just come into existence. This means it cannot have expanded infinitely into the past. Okay? Now, I'm going to skip over this next section about life-giving aliens because it's Richard Dawkins talking about intelligent design, but his intelligent designer is aliens. I'll let you read that because our time is of the essence here. But I just think it's funny. There's this technical bit here. Abiogenesis is the term used to describing living matter coming from non-living matter. Okay? To date, we have never observed abiogenesis. Okay, so if scientists believe that abiogenesis had to happen for life to exist in the universe, we have never been able to observe it happening at all. And it would be alarming for lab research if it happened regularly. Right? Can you imagine if in the morning you got up and you pulled a freshly so-called clean mug out of the dishwasher, and you pulled it out, you set it on the counter, and you were about to pour yourself some coffee or some tea, and life was constantly happening in your coffee mug, or worse, your salad at the, like any of those things would be highly alarming for us if we said, oh, well, I've just now chewed on a new living organism that I stopped evolution. This next technical bit I think is worth calling out. We need to make a distinction as Christians between microevolution, the idea that there's small variations, like between moths and butterflies and different kinds of cats and dogs, and macroevolution, the idea that life came from small primordial sludge, right? Go ahead.
And what they call them, cells, amoebas.
Yeah.
I think they call them.
Yeah, they came from an amoebic or single cell organisms. The Bible supports the concept of microevolution. So we want to say, when people say, oh, Christians don't believe in evolution, I would argue, say, yes, we do. We just believe in microevolution, minor variation, but not changing from beast type to beast type, not from monkeys to man, not from whales to pigs or vice versa, or cows. If you look at the flow of evolution, we have some really bizarre things that they've hypothesized simply because limbs might look similar. How many times did the eyeball evolve, for example? There's a pretty uniform structure for the eyeball. How many times did it evolve? Now, I want to talk about the fossil records very briefly, and that is to say that we don't have many transitional specimens in our charts, and when we do, often they're at opposing parts of the map. Okay, so you'll have so this level of horsiness was in North America, and this level of horsiness was in Africa, and this level was in Australia. But there's no connection in the fossil record between those places geographically. But since we found a fossil and it seems like it might be a logical step, we assume that must be the case, since we're assuming God isn't real. No, we're not, but they are. So the next thing I want to talk about, we talked about radiocarbon dating a little bit. And as I said, this is something my dad had worked in. We don't know how much of the material splits and changes over time, right? That's part of radioactive carbon dating, is that you check to see how much is in it now. It changes from C14 to C12. We don't know how much it started with, and we don't know how much it will end with when it's done. We have an approximation. We don't know what environmental events may have come to disrupt the amount of carbon-14 or carbon-12 there is in a material or a thing. We don't know if any was taken away. What if there was an event that pressurized through, a flood, for example, that might have caused the levels to change in the fossil? There is no scientific way to know how much material was present at the beginning when the decay started, and there's no scientific way for certain that geological, environmental, or outside events didn't cause a shift in quantities of parent materials. And so, and there is also no scientific way for us to know that parent or child materials weren't modified or taken away due to outside circumstances. And this is a great example. So everybody here on the call is familiar with Mount St. Helens, the erupted volcano in Washington State, U.S. I've been there. Yeah, I've been there, and I happen to have some inside baseball here. My mother-in-law witnessed within the state of Washington the eruption of Mount St. Helens. She was a witness, a first-person witness, okay? And I happen to know that she is in her 60s. That's as much as I'm willing to say on that. but she witnessed it, and we happen to have calendars that we can link dates and times to say that the spring of 1980, or about 40 years ago, because it's 2020 right now, that's when the eruption took place. But when they use different kinds of dating mechanisms, look at these date variations. Mount St. Helens is claimed to have originated about 40,000 years ago, just the mount itself. The rock samples from a lava dome within Mount St. Helens created were dated an age of 350,000 years ago. And then there was a separate mineral extraction that dated it to 900,000 years ago. And two mineral examples showed 170 million to 280, I'm sorry, 1.8 million to 2.8 million years ago. But we just happen to know that all of that happened 40 years ago. So which one is it? You have a real problem, because the dating methods don't show an absolute precise number, and we know the absolute precise number. That isn't to say that the dating concepts are bad concepts as far as concepts go or principles go, but because the assumption is time is expanding longer into a Big Bang theorem, we have a real problem where to use more rudimentary language, the algebra equation is off because we're assuming some things about X. So there's some other examples there I'll let you read, where since I'm running out of time, I'm going to keep moving forward. Now, I want to take a little bit of a rabbit trail, but I think this is a worthwhile rabbit trail because not enough Christians are spending time thinking about this. And that is that within modern science, because they don't have God, there are some real ethical conundrums. And this is just a beginning list. There's way more than this, okay? I don't know if you saw recently, but some Chinese scientists got in trouble for creating chimeras, which are a blend of humans and monkeys, or humans and pigs, or humans and other animals, where they're genetically splicing together two unlike species, if you will, and creating a new animal. Are these new beings soulish if they started with human DNA as part of their genetic makeup? Are they soulish? Do they represent God? Do they represent who He is? This is a big ethical problem.
If they come from man DNA is of God, it's in the image of God. So,
yeah. But ethically or morally, this is an abomination, right? This is disgusting.
Absolutely.
To take that which is made in God's image and then taint it, right?
Yeah, I agree.
Ray Kurzweil, you may know that name if you've ever played Kurzweil keyboards. I think he's associated with that, if I have my history correct. He's been working towards what he calls the singularity, the unification of computers and humans. If Ray Kurzweil is able to take his consciousness and upload it into a computer, does that computer-based being have soulishness?
Yeah, no, it's crazy.
And I would argue it doesn't, but that's mostly because I write software.
Pushing that in the films. Pushing that in the films.
Yeah.
Well, what about if they make a clone? If they make a clone, that's going to be weird.
Yeah, and I think I think we're on the precipice of that. I think the only thing stopping them from doing that is law. And then the other idea is, science is working hard to replace humans with robots or code so that any and all jobs can be automated. If the consequence of the fall is that we must work, but the consequence of these efforts is to make sure that we don't work. What does that mean?
It's the opposite from what God wanted.
Yeah. And the thing is that we also find, that throughout the scriptures, this idea that work should have value and meaning and we should enjoy it. So anyways, there's a whole bunch of places ethically that we should be thinking about. We should be voting or having conversations or discussing within the church and within the world around us, considering these things. I love science fiction. I think it's a fun form of fiction because they get to do all kinds of things. But often the books ignore God as creator as even a possibility, and they also don't address some of these ethical issues as much as they could, although some of them do attempt to do so. So we'll close with this conclusion and just kind of see where we get. Rather than looking to science for an explanation for a universe without a cause, which is a self-contradictory statement, we can use science to speak to understand causes and understand God who made the universe. Scientist Sir Isaac Newton pursued science because he wanted to know how God made the universe. Christians have been researching and inventing as a reflection of their being made in God's image and their desire to know their creator. And we should defend our faith with facts and understand the problems that are being glossed over and reflect the light of our holy God.